Do you wish you could make more flexibility progress with less time spent stretching? Well, cool. I think I'm gonna like you. Like yourself, when I was trying to figure out how to get flexible a few years ago, I searched around on the internet to try to figure out what methods were available and what people are actually doing. And the vast majority of the methods that I found fall into one of two boxes. Either they were very high frequency, like a daily 10 to 20 minute follow along mobility practice, or they were very high volume, like 60 to 90 minute yoga flow sessions done 3 to 4 times a week. And so I started to form this belief that the only way that I could get flexible was either to do it every single day or at least to spend a lot of time doing it. And I started to think, well, damn, maybe this flexibility thing just isn't for me. I don't want to spend hours stretching. I want the limited time that I have to dedicate to physical activity doing things that I love, that are really, really fun, like lifting weights and doing sports and doing activities outside with my friends. I don't want to be chained to a stretching habit. And if the price to pay is giving up a huge amount of time, well, maybe it's just not for me. Maybe it's not worth it. But luckily, dear viewer, I realized that that belief was in fact a delusion, as in fact, it's possible to make durable, long-term flexibility gains in just 10 to 20 minutes a week by dialing up the intensity of the stretching session while leaving the frequency and the volume quite low. So before I explain why I like using high intensity stretching rather than high frequency or high volume, I want to first give a caveat here. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and try to pretend like high frequency or high volume training doesn't work. It absolutely does. I'm not going to try to deny the real experience of all the thousands of people who have done yoga or gymnastic style stretching practices in their lives. If that works for you, if you find that motivating and you're able to dedicate the time for it and to keep up those habits, that's awesome. That's great for you. I'm happy for you. This is more for the rest of my audience who either doesn't have that much time to devote or who has already tried these other flexibility methods and found that they were harder to stick to than they thought. Just here to raise awareness on different methods of training that I think might better serve a large proportion of you watching. Okay, sick intro, John. Now how does this actually work? I think it's useful to ask ourselves the question, how does the body adapt to training? And we can explore this without getting very scientific here. I'm not a biologist, I'm just a guy who's trying to figure out how to stretch effectively in as little time as possible. And that is done by experimenting with actual flexibility protocols and watching as our measured flexibility in a position gets deeper over time as we stack session upon session. So we'll go over to my handy dandy smartboard over here and draw ourselves a little graph. So the vertical axis is going to be performance. And performance just means how good we are at the thing. What is our ability in it? So in flexibility, that's going to be the depth or the range of motion that we're able to get to in some sort of pose. In strength training, this could be your strength, aka like the amount of weight lifted or the number of reps you can compete, something like that. In endurance or running, this could be your pace or your time in a race over a fixed distance. And we can imagine that in any activity, before we start it, we have some sort of baseline skill, which I'll indicate as this dotted line here. So what happens to your performance when you do some sort of workout? Well, as you start to acquire a little bit of fatigue. So your performance drops for a little bit. Depending on the modality, it might look like having to slow down your pace on a run. When you're lifting weights, it might be that the bar's slowing down and the reps get harder and harder until eventually you can't lift them anymore. Or it could just be your perception of the difficulty. It feels harder to complete and you feel like you're closer to your max effort. Now you might be saying, wait, hold up, John. That's true for lifting weights or for running, but for stretching, it feels different. After I stretch for 5 to 10 minutes, I feel really, really loose, and I actually feel like I can move better for the next hour or so. Well, if that's the case, then what you have done during your stretching was probably just a really good warm-up. Warming up for an activity makes us perform them better, right? If you wanted to do a set of pull-ups, you wouldn't just throw on a bunch of weight on the weight belt and start cranking out your max effort. You would probably spend 5 to 20 minutes warming up, right? You'd start at a slightly lower intensity and gradually work to a higher intensity until you're ready for those working sets. But if you stopped after the warm-up, well, you probably wouldn't get stronger next time, would you? Because it's actually those working sets that leave you tired and performing worse that make you stronger in the long run. So if you find that every time you stretch, you feel really, really loose right afterwards, Well, you're probably just quitting during the warm-up, and that might be why you're not making much progress and why it always feels like you need to warm up to access your flexibility after you've built it. But that's okay, we're gonna fix that. So back to our lovely smartboard here. At some point, you're gonna stop the training here, and then what happens after you stop training? Well, if you tried to repeat that same effort, you wouldn't be able to do it, or you'd be able to do it worse. So our level of performance is lower, which begs the question, why the fuck do we train? This is a terrible deal. You do something, it feels hard, and then it makes you worse? Like, this is a terrible deal. Why would anyone do this? Obviously, then there's some sort of magic that happens afterwards called recovery. Some sort of biological this, some sort of metabolic that, some sort of enzyme cascade, some sort of electron transport chain this. We don't need to understand deeply what happens physically. Honestly, I think it's more useful to think of it like the following. One part of your body sends a text message to another part of your body saying, bro, that was embarrassing. Do better next time. And your body responds saying, bro, I'm on it. Give me some healthy food, give me 9 hours in bed, and just give me some freaking time. I got you, bro. Right? What's important is that something happens and some amount of time elapses, and eventually we are recovered. So that kind of looks like this. Going back up and then down. So this kind of looks like a sine curve, but don't get too caught up in the slope of this line and the height of this line. It's just a mental model meant to inform our training, right? So what would happen if we were to train again right here when our level is lower than before? And this would be reaching into essentially overtraining. You're trying to do the next workout before you've recovered from the previous workout, and so you're actually able to do less than you were the first time. In other words, you've had a negative adaptation to the workout instead of a positive one. It's much better to wait sometime in this zone here, which we call supercompensation. This is when your body has adapted and is ready to take on a harder challenge, and it stays this way for some amount of time, and then eventually you revert back to that baseline. So that is the training adaptation in a nutshell. So there are a couple of qualitative things I want you to note here in these diagrams. First is that the strength of the stimulus, how intense it is, does seem to control how high the supercompensation part goes. So in other words, the lower we go during the training session, the higher it comes back to. So this tells us that if we work a bit harder during any given of our sessions, the potential growth from that is a bit larger. The second thing to note is that the strength of the stimulus doesn't seem to affect the slope or the rate of recovery. So imagine if we had two here where we had a small stimulus and then it goes up at, let's say, 45 degrees here and then comes back to baseline. If we do instead a deeper stimulus, it still will go up at roughly the same slope. And so what this means is that the training itself does not affect the recovery rate, but if we have more training to recover from, it will take more time, right? This distance here on the time axis is larger from the high intensity thing than in this case here, right? But the training itself doesn't actually make the recovery faster or slower. In fact, other lifestyle factors play more of a role in that, like your nutrition, your sleep, your stress, just everything that influences recovery. So the implication here is that if you take the training to a deeper level, then you have to wait longer in order for the recovery and supercompensation to happen, but it will allow you to start from a higher level, and it will increase the amount of time that the supercompensation is happening. So in other words, instead of having an adaptation that lasts, say, 1 day, it could last 3 to 5 days, for instance. I'm just making these exact figures up, but you get the idea. Now it'll be useful to draw out two different styles of training. First, we'll do a high frequency version. So let's say we start here. We have this level, we get a small stimulus, we come back up, and then right about there, we hit that second workout. Goes down again, comes back up, goes a little higher. We have that third workout. Goes down again, come back up, fourth workout, etc. So you can see how by stacking individual training sessions over time, we increase the baseline, and eventually over hundreds or even thousands of sessions over months and years and decades of training, we increase our performance drastically, right? So that is training programming in a nutshell. So this example I drew here, you could imagine that on the x-axis, we're looking at time again. So the first day session would be day 0. Maybe the second session here is done at day 1, then day 2, then day 3, etc. So this would be a daily practice. You're trying to give yourself a small stimulus such that you can recover in 24 hours, and such that when you do that next session, you're fully recovered, you're super compensated, you get a little bit deeper the next day. So that is how a daily flexibility practice might look. As I've drawn it, it works. However, there are a few problems with that. The first thing is that as humans, getting the intensity right in every single workout is pretty unrealistic. You're not going to get exactly the stimulus you want with every single workout. Sometimes you'll get a little bit more or a little bit less. So if you had gotten a little bit more in this scenario, then it's going to take a little bit longer to recover. And so it might be that when you are doing your second session, 24 hours, you're not actually fully recovered. And so you're actually starting off from here. And so then we can see in that case that you would have been better off actually just waiting another day in order to do that session. And in fact, the session that you did on the first day was actually a negative stimulus. It was actually a total waste of time. So we want to be able to avoid that scenario as much as possible, just to make sure that we're not wasting workouts and we're not wasting time spent working out, right? Another thing that can happen with super high frequency training is that life gets in the way and you have to skip a session. Now, when that happens, because the window of super compensation is so small, it's very easy to miss that window and either wait too short of a time or too long of a time, and such that your training sessions don't always stack on top of each other, right? So now contrast this with a high intensity stretching session. I'll draw this one out big because this will basically be my last one, I think. Let's imagine our baseline is here, and we do a nice high intensity stretching session here on day 0. We go down real deep, and then it takes a while to recover, and then we go back. Now, just for shits and gigs, this could be 0, this could be, well, that's the end of our training session. Let's say here is 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. Okay, let's say roughly there. We can see from this simple graph that there are 2 main advantages from this type of training. First of all, the number of training periods, so this right there, that we have in a given week or in a given unit of time is going to be less on average, right? It takes us less time to actually do our work, and then we spend more time recovering from it. But of course, time spent recovering from it is just time prioritizing all of the other important things in life and benefiting from our flexibility as well, right? So it's more time efficient. The second and often overlooked part is that I think it's actually easier to schedule and fit into a realistic weekly schedule. And the reason for this is simple. As we talked about with the high frequency setting, if you miss one session, it makes your previous session pretty much useless. And the effectiveness of a high frequency program drops rapidly as you miss days. And if you're like me, you're gonna miss some days. Sometimes you're gonna have to deprioritize the things in your life that are just hobbies and not absolute needs, right? And so in a high intensity stretching method, we're planning to do our next stretching session between day 2 and day 5. And that gives us a huge amount of flexibility in when we do it. Imagine that, a flexibility program that's actually flexible, right? We'll see the best results if we actually manage to hit the peak of our super compensation there. But of course, we can't actually measure these things and we don't know exactly when that will be. But generally speaking, if you're not able to do it on day 3 because your kid gets sick, then you can just do it on day 4 or day 5. And so the likelihood that you have to miss a day but aren't able to make up that day within the super compensation window is much, much lower. So this workout is going to be doubly more potent. It's more potent when you do it, and more likely that you will be able to hit that second workout in the amount of time required to actually consolidate gains. So now I imagine you can start to see why a high intensity method can be a really useful tool. Not to say that high frequency or high volume methods don't have their own use cases, but this one just seems to be really practical for the average athlete who's not trying to spend a huge amount of time and who still wants to see gains. So the next question you're asking might be, John, that sounds cool, but how do I actually stretch at a high intensity? What does that look like? Well, I've got good news for you. Your stretching starter pack awaits below. It has video tutorials of how to do exactly this. If that doesn't interest you, then just watch this next video. I have tons of content on this. And if you have any other specific questions, drop them in the comments and I'll be sure to cover them in a future episode. Thank you so much for your time. Let's get strong and flexible together. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.